I don't know how they do inaugurations in France, but imagine that a new president of France gets elected, gets chosen, and to get everything going on their first day, they're like, all right, we're going to do a special ceremony, and it's going to be at Normandy Beach. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to have all the people gather around. There's going to be like grandstands and temporary seating and everything, and then we're going to have a bunch of boats come in from the English Channel, and they're going to land, and soldiers are going to run off of the boats onto Normandy Beach. Now, even if nothing was in any way said about D-Day, wouldn't you just look at all of that ceremony and think to yourself, oh, well, it's iconic. It's obviously a nod to D-Day. I see what we're doing there. If there were an event that was celebrating the feisty, rebellious spirit of the United States of America, and a politician wanted to put on this event, and they did a thing where a whole bunch of people were on an old clipper ship or some old wooden boat, and they pulled up into a harbor as a bunch of people were gathered around, and there's American flags flying and music playing, and they all took a bunch of boxes labeled tea, and they were all dressed up like Indians, and they threw the tea off of the boat into the water. Even if they didn't say anything about the Boston Tea Party, you would be able to look at that and go, okay, that was probably intentional. That's very iconic. I see what they're hearkening back to. Whatever is happening here today politically, they're trying to attach it to this previous thing that occurred. And likewise, at this dedication of the wall ceremony that we're reading about in Nehemiah chapter 12, you have an event being orchestrated here by a brilliant leader who is very well aware of the grand story of his people dating back thousands of years, and he's very well aware, he feels strongly that is, that the moment they are in right now is part of that story. It's a part that was predicted, it's a part that is inevitable, and he has grabbed the reins. It's like, we are doing this. This is the moment to do it, and this isn't just the next thing that's happening. This is the next chapter in this story. He has firmly located himself and his people in this story overtly at every turn. So it wouldn't be a surprise if, just like the two hypothetical events that I just made up a second ago, if like that, in that fashion, he did things here that were evocative of other parts of the story that Nehemiah would imagine would bring symmetry or recollection, or would draw on the themes of previous stories that are deeply ensconced in the hearts and minds and emotions of the people here at this event as well, to connect the dots together for them, so that once again they would understand what this is and where this thing fits. And I think that's exactly what he does, even if he isn't overt in spelling it out, even if he isn't standing up in front of everybody and being like, I'm having these people walk this way because it kind of reminds you of that thing. It would be very insulting in the two examples I just made up a minute ago if somebody got up front and was like, does it remind you of anything? D-Day, perhaps? It'd be like, okay, it's a little on the nose. It is pretty obvious. Thank you. We got it. So likewise here, I don't think Nehemiah had to say anything about what this imagery that he was putting together, that he was orchestrating, would conjure. I think it just speaks for itself, and all I'm going to do is just connect the dots for those of us who are living a little bit later on and might not automatically think in these categories. Nehemiah 12:31. I, Nehemiah, had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. Okay, that had to be dramatic, first of all, because everybody's in their finest attire. Everybody's wearing the clothes that communicates their job and their role. And down below, all of the attendees of this event are in this natural amphitheater. And there's music, the best music, I mean, the most modern expressions of ancient lyrics born out of this creative musical enclave, or these series of enclaves made in these musical villages, which I continue to think is just the coolest thing ever. And now all of that music is being debuted. This wasn't garbage. There was a horrible version of the national anthem performed maybe last night, 2 nights ago, at the Major League Baseball Home Run Derby, and it's the kind of thing that had the exact opposite effect. And God bless that poor girl. Maybe she's really, I don't know who she is. Maybe she's good at music or whatever, but wow, that is the roughest outing I've maybe ever heard of the national anthem, including Carl Lewis's attempt at it. Is bad. And admittedly, it was a total vibe killer. All of that sense of patriotism and pride and baseball is America's sport. It was gone. You were just dying for the presentation, the performance to please end. I can't imagine that was the case here. I have to imagine that Nehemiah knew what he was getting. He, as well as, you'll recall, King Artaxerxes, someone Nehemiah worked very closely with, understood the power of music and performance. That's why the king continued to oversee all of that in his entire empire. What a crazy thing for the king to want to keep ownership of. But he did. It says so one chapter earlier, Nehemiah 11:23, the singers were under the king's orders, which regulated their daily activity. So this is going to be excellent, and it's going to be modern, and it's going to be new, and it's going to be creative, and people haven't heard this before. I really think there was a new movement in music happening here, and I bet it was remarkable. And the choirs, there are two of them we're going to look at here in a minute, they start to come out and they start to sing. And all of these musical instruments, which are tuned and dialed and expertly played, they start playing. I have to imagine that these artists had a great sense of dynamic, that they didn't just come out blaring as hard as they could, but that there is this ebb and flow to it. I remember my choir director in college saying that it's way harder to sing soft than it is to sing loud. I don't think that's new knowledge. I bet they knew that back then. Clearly, they understood how art challenges and provokes the soul and the emotions. And I have to imagine that as this music swelled and it got to a certain volume, that people started to feel it. And I don't just mean emotionally feel it. I mean that feel it where you hit the resonant tone of a room or a space, or the chest cavity that you carry with you where it's like, oh, wow, that music isn't just outside of me, it's in me. My body is resonating with what is being performed here. And it's a moment. And I think they have got a moment happening here in this carefully orchestrated event. But that still doesn't get us to what it's evocative of. Let me get to that now. So it goes on. Nehemiah says, I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed on top of the wall to the right toward the dung gate. And then we're going to skip a whole bunch of verses that I read yesterday. These are all, it covers all the people once again who were involved in all of that. We skip down to verse 37 and we pick back up with what that first choir was going to do. It says this, at the fountain gate they continued directly up the steps of the city of David on the ascent to the wall and passed above the house of David to the water gate on the east. Now that hint right there in the language, ascent, gives me a clue as to what psalms might have been sung here. I think probably the final aggregation process of the Psalms, as in the book of Psalms that you and I see in the Bible today, was probably happening right around this time in Jewish history. Now, in that book, there are certain Psalms that are labeled Psalms of Ascent, the idea that these are things that you would sing as you go up toward the house of the Lord. So we'll talk more about that later on, because I think we can probably figure out what some of the songs that they were actually singing were, what some of the words they were singing and that people were hearing actually were, which I think is really, really cool. So choir number 1 is on one side of the event, moving in a certain direction as people are up and along the walls, moving along the walls. And then in verse 38, we find out what the second choir is doing. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I, Nehemiah, followed them on top of the wall, together with half the people, past the tower of the ovens to the broad wall, over the gate of Ephraim, the Jeshanah gate, the fish gate, the tower of Hanel, and the tower of the 100, as far as the sheep gate. At the gate of the guard they stopped. The 2 choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God. So did I, together with half the officials. And there's a list of names and some other stuff, and we'll talk about what happens there in a minute. But picture this scene. What does it remind you of? You've got gigantic groups of musicians moving in 2 different directions around a whole bunch of walls on a fortified city in the ancient Near East. Are you shrieking the word Jericho? Because that's where my head goes, right? It's symmetry here that we're getting from Nehemiah. I think he's intentionally echoing stuff from the book of Joshua, where all of this started. Where did they get Jerusalem? Well, it was a promise of God, but it wasn't realized under the leadership of Moses. Moses gave them instructions for how to go and get it. But it was Joshua who actually ended up being the leader of the generation that went and took possession of the thing that God promised them and God miraculously gave them, including this, their ancestral capital, this, the place where God made his long-standing dwelling among them. So he's hearkening back to the first real conquest of that larger series of conquests, which was maybe the most difficult one, the most impossible one, the one that barred the way from entering the Holy Land at all, a place that had a huge orbit of strategic control, that being Jericho. How did they defeat Jericho? Well, you remember the story. They walked around it and just played trumpets a whole bunch, and the walls imploded. I mean, it's a wild, crazy, miraculous demonstration of the power of God, and it put all of the people of Canaan on notice that the one true actual God who your fake gods of wood and stone cannot compete with is behind this conquest. This isn't another little regional religious squabble where God's names are invoked to justify it. The first conquest made it clear this is different than that sort of thing. This is ordained by God, and this victory will be won supernaturally by the power of God. Now, I know there are a bunch of you listening to this who are like, I hear you frame it that way, but I don't know. I like the Bible. This is interesting. I'm interested in God and Jesus and all of that. And I don't accept that narrative. I think that the Old Testament is still an ancient Near Eastern conquest account, and whoever won was going to ascribe it to the power of their God. Cool. I get that we see that differently, and I totally get why one could see it that way. And most of all, what I would want to say to you, if that's what you're thinking as I'm saying this stuff, is, dang, thanks for being here and not having to think all the same things I think and read it the exact same way I read it. It's cool that we can just be in process with each other and think about it. If the Bible was just an account of some military victories and then, it's God who did it, and also there were some miracles we promised, there really, really were, I'd probably see it the same way you do, my friend. However, the rest of the Bible informs back to me on those accounts of the conquest in such a way that I see how it fits in, and I see why God would want to do miraculous things on the front end of that so people wouldn't mistake it for just another conquest, just another regional squabble. And so for me, the bigger picture of the Bible is what informs my interpretation of those conquests more than those conquests informing my interpretation of the rest of the Bible. And I'm content to just kind of leave that where it is for the moment with you and I. All of that to say, Nehemiah, I mean, come on. We've been hanging out with him for, how long has it been? Half a year? More than that at this point. He's impressive. He's smart. He knows what he's doing. He didn't end up being the cupbearer to the most powerful person on earth because he was a bumbling idiot. He's shrewd. He's strategic. He understands the power of ideas and story and art. He didn't do this on accident. It's meant to be symmetrical. God toppled the walls with motion and music just like this. And in the same way that that was obviously miraculous, so Nehemiah is saying, and he has said overtly, it is by the power of God that these walls have now been rebuilt. The same power of the same God, though separated by a millennia, here we are back in the exact same place. This is symmetrical. This has come full circle. There's no good place here to hit pause because I just need to work through this entire idea, but I'm going to split this into two parts. We're going to pick up right where we left off tomorrow. But before we go, I've got a quick invitation for you. This Saturday, July 20th, 2024, there's an event in my hometown, Rapid City, South Dakota, called Hills Alive. It's a Christian music thing. It's free. I don't know a ton about it. I don't know a ton about Christian music. I don't know any of the artists who are performing, literally zero, but I'm sure they're good. It's great, everything. I don't know, it just seems like a nice event, and the people there seem real cool, and so I thought I would go up this Saturday and hang around and see what it's all about. I am going to be at the corner of the lake where they rent out the kayaks next to the main stage at 5:30 this Saturday. If any of you happen to go to this thing or you happen to be around, I'm just going to bum around over there for a little bit. Maybe we'll have a chance to say hello if you're in town. Maybe I'll see you on Saturday. If not, that's cool too. Either way, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.